Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. As Donald Trump and the Republican-controlled Congress try to put the final nails in the coffin of the New Deal, we're discussing the origins of the New Deal and what happened to it. We're calling this series The Undoing of the New Deal. And as I say, while Trump and gang are trying to more or less end it, they didn't start this process. And we're telling this story in a series of interviews with historian Peter Kuznick, who now joins us from Washington. Peter is a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He's the co-writer with Oliver Stone of The Untold History of the United States. Before we pick up the story with the Truman administration, Peter, you wanted to add a few things about what the New Deal was. And again, I urge you, go back if you're watching this segment and haven't watched the earlier ones. Really, it's worth it. Go back to part one and work your way up here. Go ahead, Peter.
We talked about the way people have dismantled the New Deal. Unfortunately, President Roosevelt began the process himself. In 1936, as we were saying, the left was dominant in the United States. The right wing was largely wiped out. You've got not only on the national scale, but you've got Upton Sinclair running for governor in California on the EPIC ticket, End Poverty in California. You've got Huey Long's Share the Wealth programs in Louisiana. You've got Francis Townsend. You've got a whole broad array of reformers. We've got the Popular Front during this time. So the left Democrats dominate. The Republican right wing is decimated after the 36 election. But Roosevelt makes some blunders. And one of those blunders is his attempt to rebalance the budget in 1937. So he imposes sharp budget cuts some of the funding for New Deal programs, and the economy plummets into a new recession in 1937. It was called the Roosevelt Depression.
Roosevelt was not a Keynesian. He didn't believe in stimulus and unbalanced budgets.
I say he was a partial Keynesian, but Roosevelt was not very much ideological. He was not deeply philosophical. Roosevelt was somebody who operated based upon personal charm. You know, he could say "my old friend" in more than a dozen languages. He was a charmer. He charmed Stalin even. But was not deeply ideological and not an intellectual in that sense. And it was under some pressure from the right, even though there was no real right-wing pressure that needed to affect him. And so he cuts the budget in 1937. The economy plummets, and then he restores some of the funding. But in terms of the real New Deal reform spirit, it's ended by that point. And so, as we mentioned earlier, when the Wagner Act is introduced in 1939 for a real national health care program, Roosevelt cuts out the support for that, even though the progressives, the reformers, thought that was going to be the heart of the reform program going forward, to create a real national health care program, the idea that health care is a fundamental right that everybody deserves. From that point on. And as you know, we would go forward to the point where we used to be able to say that there were two countries in the world that didn't have a national health care program, two industrial countries. One was the United States, the other was South Africa. But South Africa does have a national health care program. So now the United States is the only major industrial country that doesn't have a national health care program that covers all of its population. It's really shameful. The other
why did Roosevelt not support the Wagner Act? Why didn't he support a national health care plan?
In some ways, it's baffling. He wanted to run for a third term in 1940. And among the groups that was in the forefront of the opposition to the national health care program was the AMA. So even though progressive physicians...
The American
Medical Association attacked the Wagner Act as communism. They were a small minority and a small voice, but they had certain influence in the United States. And so the university professors, led by the faculties at Harvard and Yale, were the leadership of the need for a national health care program. And they were supported by academic physicians around the country, but the private practitioners represented by the AMA led the fight against it. And Roosevelt decided, and planning to run again for re-election in 1940, that he didn't want to take on this kind of challenge and get into a fight with the physicians and some of the other people who were opposed to this kind of sweeping healthcare reform. And the other point that you mentioned before about what was happening during the Clinton time, Clinton does dismantle key elements in the New Deal. It's Clinton who ends aid to families of dependent children, which was one of the key New Deal measures that had lasted from the 1930s until the 1990s before it was buried by the Clinton administration. And that was an important setback. There was a major fight about that between the conservative Democrats siding with the Republicans and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. But what we know now, in a lot of ways, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is far to the left now of what it was in the 1990s. For example, in 1994, 52% of Democrats thought that immigration was a good thing. In 2017, 84% of Democrats say immigration is a good thing. Similar kinds of shifts in terms of single payer in the United States from that time to now. So we have, in some ways, the Democratic Party is far to the left of what it was back in the 1990s when Clinton was in control.
So what other measures then? Let's move back to Truman. In an earlier episode, we talked about Truman purging Wallace and other of the New Dealers from his administration. And that was partly over foreign policy issues with Wallace. To what extent does Truman want to undo the New Deal in terms of the domestic policies?
Truman thought he was protecting the New Deal. Truman thought that by eliminating the left wing of the Democratic Party, especially those who were in any way associated with the communists, that he was protecting the New Deal. The Republicans had begun running against the New Deal in 1946, when they kept saying that the New Deal was a communist program. And the idea was that communists had had important positions within the Roosevelt administration, the New Deal administration. So you've got J. Parnell Thomas beginning the hearings with the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1946. And the first group who they target was the atomic scientists. They said that E.U. Condon, with the head of the National Bureau of Standards, and others represented the weakest link in our national security. So they say that there's atomic espionage, and they start warning about that. And there was a case in Ottawa of a Soviet-linked spy network that was discovered. And so they were able to play upon this fear of atomic espionage starting in 1946. But even though they target the scientists as the first group they attack, the first round of hearings is not on the scientists. The first round of hearings is on Hollywood, because they knew they wanted to curb the influence of the left in Hollywood.
4 years before McCarthy hearings, is that right?
Years before McCarthy, is, as we mentioned last time, doesn't come on the scene. His famous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia is February 9th, 1950, where he says, "I've got the list of however many communists who work in the State Department," and the number keeps changing, right? So finally he comes up with the number 57, and in the one famous movie, he's looking at a Heinz ketchup bottle, and then he announces that 57 is the number of communists.
We should talk about the Communist Party in the United States and the people active in the American Communist Party. We're essentially fighting for socialist-style reforms within the United States. Whatever the Soviet Union was or wasn't, and that's another conversation. Yeah. The American communists were not very different than all kinds of American socialists who were fighting for some kind of social democracy in the U.S.
That's largely true. There's a big debate among historians to what extent the Soviet Union exercised control over the American Communist Party. And at the top level,
even if they did what they were actually advocating and fighting for, wasn't much different than what other socialists were. I think there's plenty of evidence there was lots of more than interaction between the Soviet Union and the American Communist Party.
A lot of it did not translate down to the grassroots level. You look at, for example, Robin Kelly's got a terrific book about Communist Party in Alabama, Hammer and Hoe. And you see almost no influence in terms of the grassroots organizing, the sharecroppers unions, the steelworkers, the things that the Communist Party were doing. The Communist Party was leading the fight against segregation in the United States. The Communist Party, there's a debate among historians now, when we trace the beginning of the civil rights movement. Where did it start? We don't, now historians are not looking at it as a Southern movement that began in 1956 or with the Montgomery bus boycott of 55. They're not looking at it only in terms of the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas in 1954. They're looking at it in terms of the civil rights movement, the desegregation movement in New York City, led by communists in the 1940s and 1950s. So the Communist Party was out front on that issue. They were very strong on a lot of other kinds of progressive reform. Who was supporting the integration of baseball? It was Paul Robeson and the communists who were doing this first. There were a lot of things that the Communist Party was doing that would later be adopted. Support for Social Security. I mean, Norman Thomas and the Socialists were also involved in that. So most of the policies that the communists adopted in the United States were not going to help the Soviet Union in the Cold War, but certain policies were clearly to get the United States to stand down in terms of the Soviet Union.
Let's not forget that the United States had just not long ago bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki with atomic weapons, and many historians, I think including you, think it was mostly a shot across the bow of the Soviet Union, not something needed to end the war with Japan. So the espionage that was certainly going on in the United States was about that you're dealing with a country that's threatening the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. And it's a whole big conversation about the relationship of the Soviet Union to the American Communist Party, because a lot of people think it damaged the efforts of the American Communist Party in many ways. But I think but just the boogeyman of the word communist, there's so many years of Cold War here, you can't even mention the word without it bringing up such demonization.
The Communist Party, the Soviet Union, although in the early 1930s, the American communists were able to point to the Soviet Union as the example of the one country that was not hurt by the Depression. In fact, when there were rumors that the Soviets wanted to hire American workers to work in Soviet industry, there were riots at the offices, the trade offices, the Soviet trade offices in the United States, because American workers were so desperate to get jobs in the Soviet Union. So the image of the Soviet Union as a country that had been not affected by and you see this being written about in the New York Times, in Business Week, in Christian Science Monitor, in American conservative publications, was that the Soviet Union had not been affected by the economy, by the Depression, that the Soviet 5-year plan was working, that the Soviet Union was committed to science and technology and growth and progress, that the Soviet Union had socialized medicine and programs for women. I mean, there was a certain very positive image of the Soviets for a while, but then later in the decade, the image of the Soviets began with the purges, and we find out more about Stalinist repression, and the image of the Soviet Union declines. But during World War II, the image of the Soviet Union again is very positive. As a reporter in the New York Times says, we owe our future as a democratic society to the Soviet victory over fascism. So the Americans appreciated the fact that the Soviets were the ones who were doing the fighting against fascism and defeating fascism. There were second front rallies all across the United States. Roosevelt promised to open up a second front in Western Europe in May of 1942. Molotov comes over, Roosevelt meets with him and says that we'll open up a second front before the end of 1942. And then Churchill backs out, and the United States doesn't end up opening up the second front till June of 1946. It's during that time that the Soviets turn the tide of the war against the Nazis, and the Soviets move and push the Germans back and are occupying Eastern and Central Europe. So Roosevelt doesn't give up anything at Yalta that the Soviets didn't already control at that point. But the image of the Soviet Union was a much more positive one during that time, which is why Truman has to make such great effort to turn the American people against the Soviets, because we've got to undermine that heroic image that they had occupied from 1942 until 1945, really, during that period.
And when the workers come back from Europe, the soldiers come back from Europe and are workers again, my understanding, I think it's in 44, 45, certainly after the war, is the year with the most strikes in the history of the country, before or since.
Yes, absolutely.
It's a height of working class militancy. The Soviet Union at least looks like it's a model of an alternative, which explains also part of why so many of the elites supported the New Deal. And the promise that capitalism can provide everything socialism does. In other words, full long-term employment for all and such. That was going to be the promise. Capitalism could achieve more than the socialism could offer. You don't need that as the alternative.
The tragedy, really, of the 20th century is that the Soviet revolution, the communist revolution, was such a bust. I mean, Marx had warned about this, right? Marx says that the communist revolution should not occur first in Russia, because Russia is too economically and culturally backward. Marx envisioned the communist revolution occurring in an advanced industrial country like Germany or the United States. That was his vision. And the Soviet Union sadly lives down to Marx's expectations. But that's held up as what socialism is. And that's a tragedy, because we don't have a positive image of a socialist alternative.
I had a line that was sort of funny. Socialism in a backward country is backward socialism.
Yeah.
There's some truth to that. All right, we got a little bit more time in this segment. So let's go the broad strokes. There's a big post-war expansion now. The United States emerges as the great power. Soviet Union lies in ruins with, almost 30 million people dead. Europe is in ruins. The United States has an enormous expansion of the economy. There's not such a need for these kind of direct workfare programs, direct federally funded programs and such. Much of the social safety net still exists. How does this undoing of the New Deal unfold from Truman on? Let's just sort of broad strokes.
There was a lot of concern at the end of the war that the United States was going to plunge back into a depression. The real fundamental structural problems in capitalism had not been solved by the New Deal, as we saw in 1937, but they do get solved temporarily by a massive increase in defense spending. And so the United States is loath to really cut defense spending as rapidly as people had hoped it would after the war in order to actually rebuild the domestic economy. As you're saying, the United States is the only country in the world that comes out of World War II looking good. It's the only economy that's thriving. Everybody else had been decimated. The European economies had gone back decades. The unemployment was rampant. The housing was destroyed. You had massive refugee populations. We didn't know what was going to happen. It looked like, and the Communist Party was quite strong. In countries like Italy and France, it probably could have seized power. And that's one of the things that we have to recognize about Stalin. The accusation about Stalin is that Stalin had some master plan for global conquest. That's what the right-wingers claimed in the United States and elsewhere in the early Cold War years. Stalin did not have a master plan. Stalin was very, very defensive and in some ways very conservative. Stalin's hope was to rebuild the Soviet Union and to gain security. His vision for security, unlike Roosevelt wanted an institutional response. He set up the United Nations. He thought that through the United Nations we could achieve world peace. Stalin wanted a buffer zone. He'd been invaded twice by Germany through Eastern Europe. He didn't trust Germany, of course, and he didn't trust Eastern Europe, so he wanted a buffer zone. He didn't want lockstep governments. What he wanted were friendly governments in Eastern Europe. And he allows a measure of democracy in Eastern Europe that lasts really until 1947 and 1948. It's not until the Truman Doctrine, till the U.S. takes over for the British in Iran, in Greece, and Turkey, that Stalin clamps down and puts in the dictatorial regimes in Eastern Europe that were so odious for decades. So there was a period. From 41 until 47 where we could have had a very different relationship with the Soviet Union. That's what Wallace understood. And that's what Roosevelt understood. In 1942, May of 42, Roosevelt calls for 4 policemen. He says the United States, the Soviets, the Chinese, and the British have got to police the post-war world, create a world of peace and prosperity and stability. And he always envisioned the U.S. and the Soviets working together, as did Wallace. And that was the vision that Wallace runs on in 48, when he runs on his third-party campaign, as opposed to Truman, who red-baits Wallace and accuses him of communist ties and sympathies. Wallace was not anti-communist, and was not pro-communist. What Wallace wanted always was a peaceful competition between the American system and the Soviet system to show to the world which could better serve the needs of mankind. That was Wallace's vision. And that vision was attacked and denounced by Truman as well as by the Republicans at that point.
Correct you on one thing. There was another country that emerged pretty well after the Second World War, Canada, also didn't get destroyed and got to ride the American train as American hegemony develops. We're going to have to end this segment, and we'll pick up again the next, but I think something you just said we need to pick up on more. Truman didn't demobilize after World War II. There's a massive increase, continuing increase in military expenditure. Of course, Kennedy, I think, raises the level of military expenditure to whole new stratospheric levels. And to do all that, you need the Cold War. You need an existential enemy. And so part of the way, as you just said, they deal with the issue of the capitalist crisis is through massive military expenditure. You need a massive enemy to justify the whole thing. So we'll pick this up in the next segment. Thanks for joining us again, Peter. Did you want to add anything before we finish this?
Just my apologies to the Canadians for leaving them out. I knew you wouldn't let me get away with that, Paul.
It's okay. I'm also Canadian, so I'm sensitive on these issues. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
Thank you.
So we're in our winter fundraising campaign. We have a $200,000 matching grant, so we're trying to raise a total of $400,000 before the year is over. Hopefully we can raise more than that. Unique content like Undoing the New Deal. I don't think you see it anywhere else, this kind of a conversation. I mean, where else do you find on American Anywhere a real legitimate, honest conversation about the New Deal, the political forces at play, and, for example, the role of the American Communist Party? We can talk about that on The Real News without worrying about Cold War demons and all the crazy prejudice about it. You can agree or disagree with what I said or Peter Kuznick's interpretation, but we're not afraid to talk about real stuff, and we're not going to talk about it with fear of pressure. We're trying to talk about reality, and we can't do it without independent funding. It's the only reason we have these kinds of conversations, because we have funding from our viewers, and we don't get corporate funding and government funding, and we don't have to worry about advertisers. But the model doesn't work if people don't donate. And if you're watching and you're not donating, you're not helping the model work. If you are donating, thanks very much, but maybe you could donate again. Anyway, thanks very much for joining us on the Real News Network, and please join us for the continuation of this series, Undoing the New Deal.